Thank you very much. Good Sunday afternoon, good Sunday evening, and good Monday morning to all the readies around the world joining this event. It's truly a unique global event. Now, as you all know, the pandemic has sadly forced us away from the face-to-face alumni events we all love at reunions and through the year. So now we are innovating with virtual events. And today's event is the second in a series that the Reed Career Alliance, which I now co-chair, as Katie mentioned, and of the Reed Alumni Board, which we began this last summer when we brought 10 alumni panelists from around the world and the US to talk about entrepreneurship and business in the pandemic age. Today's global event continues to take advantage of technology and to bring together particularly Reed alumni who might not otherwise be able to make it to a face-to-face event. So that's the flip side of not having face-to-face events. We actually take advantage of people who are located all over the world. In fact, today we span 17 hours, or about 3/4 of our 24-hour day of time zones, from Portland to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, to the UK, where I am, France, Madagascar, Shanghai, and Papua New Guinea. This is where our panelists are located. So this means that at least 3 of our panelists have already begun their Monday morning as we speak. And 2 more of us will say goodbye to our Sundays by the time this event is over. So let me start with first a very big thank you to our dedicated Reed alumni panelists for their stamina and generosity in sharing their insights live with the rest of the Reed community. Now, we have at least 2 Reed community audiences in mind. First, we hope to generate dialogue among alumni to help those thinking through career transitions and also current students contemplating careers in specific areas. But we also hope to engage alumni more broadly and whose career paths may not necessarily be close to the specific subject of the event, but who nonetheless have an interest in how their fellow alumni have used this unique asset, which is a Reed education. These events are designed as a carefully curated set of topics and panelists to represent a broad rather than narrow range of views and issues. There is no typical Reedie, whether within a major or a class year. Therefore, we hope that by listening to the real life experiences of a diverse group of Reed alumni, like the panel we have today, and each with unique individual perspectives, that you may find inspiration to think about multiple pathways to pursue your varied career interests at whatever stage you may be in your professional life. And as is always the case at Reed, we see these conversations as hopefully spurring a continuing and growing conversation and not as the last word on any topic. Now, today's event is broadly themed around working globally across geographies and cultures and using the multiple skill sets which are usually needed for such work. And all our panelists have done so, as you will see from their bios. I also suspect our panel combines, in fact, I know our panel combines work, living, or travel experiences in over 100 countries and on every continent, and that we have among us knowledge of at least 6 languages, and several of us are dual nationals, in my case, USA and Australia, but we have others. But what will make this event unique and what will drive our conversation is understanding exactly how a Reed education has played and might still play a role in the kind of critical inquiry, intellectual curiosity, and behavioral versatility, which are more than ever urgent for working with the level of complexity we are facing globally in many different issues. Okay, now with all of that as background, I'd like to kick us off by having the panel introduce themselves. I will ask that they focus in less than 3 minutes each. And this is going to be a challenge because they have had very interesting and diverse life experiences. 3 minutes each on where and what exactly they do right now, and reflect just briefly on their post-Reed trajectory, which brought them to where they are right now. Once we situate where our panel is currently with their lives, we may come back several times to how exactly they got there, before, during, and after read. So let me start with our easternmost panel location, which is Papua New Guinea, where Erin Larson, Read 1979, has been going from her home she made in Australia since her days at Read to Papua New Guinea, to Port Moresby. Good morning, Anne, and I hope you're still enjoying your first strong cup of coffee today. Please take it away.
Okay, I'm well on my second. Look, thanks very much. Yeah, there's been a lot of years since graduation, so reflecting on my trajectory and how I get there uses a lot of time, but I'll try to focus. And it's been fun to reflect on what I did right after Read and what still resonates now, 30 some years later. So when I graduated from Read, I didn't have a single passion, but I did have an area of broad interest. And I followed that to a master's at, in Washington, DC in demography, where I had a chance to both study and work. And the Washington, DC experience and the studying was really, I think, influential for me. No doubt the Read was in the background, but a few things happened. I realized I was really interested in widespread social change, and I wanted to be part of where that was happening. I realized in Washington, more than I realized at Read in the 1970s, that there was a big world out there. It was really fascinating, and it was certainly more interesting to me than America, which at that very moment was teetering towards Ronald Reagan. I also realized I wanted a PhD. And so that led me to Australian National University to do a British style PhD. And after I graduated from that, I figured I actually knew enough to be of use. So I went off to Bangladesh to do a series of technical jobs. And that kind of set a pattern in my life where I work in research, and then I move over to technical work, and then I go back to research and teaching. And I've teetered between those two areas all of my professional life. I'm currently in Papua New Guinea in what's probably going to be the last salaried job of my life, because it's an opportunity to work with a national institute. It's been around for 50 years that is got this enormous opportunity now to not be a field site for international researchers, but actually something which is run by returning cohorts of PhD graduates and a desire, a commitment to affect the health within Papua New Guinea and respond to those needs. So I think that's really exciting. I hope I have enough time to go to what you wanted us to address, which is how Read, what brought me to Read has propelled me other places. And first is really, I really like the periphery. I like slightly odd places that are a little bit off the center of the world. So Read is not universally known, but those who know it think it's awesome. And as soon as I heard about it, I wanted to be part of it. And that same kind of being drawn to the interesting and out of the way brought me to rural Western Australia, and it's brought me to the highlands of Papua New Guinea. And secondly, throughout this session, I'm not going to talk so much about the Read experience as a student, but reflect what I've tried to bring from that as a teacher and as often in senior positions in learning institutions. And that's the remarkable job that Read has done through the decades in curating an amazing learning experience with a strong organizational culture that values all sorts of things we'll be talking about. And I've tried to take, I recognize the uniqueness, but I've tried to take some of those aspects of deliberatively managing the experience into work that I've done.
All right, and thank you so much for presenting yourself. And we'll get back to many of these aspects, particularly how you've taken Read forward to the world in the later part of our discussion. I would like to now move, thank you, Anne, and I'd like to now move, again, moving from east to west, to the Northern Hemisphere, and where Chris Moses, Read 2002, has for the past 8 years been based in Shanghai, China. Chris, thank you for making this event the first stop of your morning. I guess it's just daybreak where you are, Monday morning.
Yes, Govind, thanks so much for having me, and particularly for organizing this panel with so many other distinguished alumni, and to our audience, good morning. So yes, I am in Shanghai, China, where I have been for 8 years, and I work primarily helping to develop educational institutions. You might know that young Chinese students make up the largest number of foreign undergraduates, whether in the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and most other countries around the world. How I got here, in a sense, is a bit accidental. I had not had any particular intentions of coming to China. But from Reed, I ended up in an academic trajectory. I was interested in history, and so I went to pursue a PhD. Though I think for as much personal as intellectual reasons, I was not drawn to a career in academia, which is not the easiest on many levels. And so I began to explore some opportunities with secondary education in the US. But I think, and this relates to my experience at Reed, what I realized that I enjoyed doing most was helping to build institutions, to really create cultures that were focused on community, on an equitable participation of all constituents, and to provide opportunities that otherwise wouldn't have existed. So I was in the midst of something of a self-funded gap year, and was starting to get a bit bored, and a recruitment firm was pestering me about opportunities in Shanghai, and I just sort of thought, well, I had visited the city before, I'd take a look, and if it wasn't what I liked, I could just leave. But one thing has led to another, and I think the sort of energy and dynamism that I've discovered here, people's desire to continually create and recreate the world in a sense that reflects China's astronomical growth in the last 30 to 40 years has been energizing, has been personally fulfilling, and so I'm grateful for that. And thinking also back to Reed, I'm sure we will hear, and I value immensely the intellectual challenges, the rigor, the desire to think in original ways. But I would also mention the abilities I had, whether through student government or through other student organizations, to really reflect on what leadership meant, what it was to be part of a representative assembly, and how constructive disagreement can not only exist in a classroom, but can also be a part of organizational management, and trying to allow people to see themselves in a larger project. And so, in the parlance of 21st century pedagogy, we discuss student-centered learning. But I like to think, whether from the classroom all the way up to investors and sort of corporate strategy, really taking that to mean that students are truly the heart of learning, and the opportunities we can create for them. So I do appreciate that sentiment that I think I've carried forward from Reed, and I look forward to hearing from all our other panelists.
All right, thank you, Chris. We're going to pick up many of the threads you have already woven into our dialogue. And now we will move from China across the Indian Ocean to the great island of Madagascar off the coast of Africa. And for me personally, having worked and traveled when I was at the World Bank more than 20 times in Madagascar, it is a special pleasure to see us bring this part of the world into our conversation. And we are very fortunate to have Sahondra Rabenarivo from Read 92, who has been graciously burning the midnight oil to speak to us. Sahondra, I apologize we have kept you from your normal bedtime, and thank you for joining us.
Yes, hello everyone. from Madagascar. Indeed, it's a little bit after midnight here, and I'm a transactional lawyer here in Antananarivo, and usually I'm used to having these conference calls like at around 2 or 3 in the afternoon. I'm in the middle of the world when when we have a business call that starts in the US and crosses Europe and goes all the way to Asia. But anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here. As I said, I'm a transactional lawyer. That means that I work on project financing of infrastructure projects, so what I hope are transformational projects here in Madagascar. At the moment, I'm doing a lot of power work, electricity, and a recently closed transaction was for the building of 2 new international airports in Madagascar. But ever since I came back in 2004, after 17 years in the States, I've also always done something else. So a few months after returning to Madagascar, I was asked to join the board of a newly created biodiversity fund. And I know that Madagascar is much more famous for its biodiversity than for its business environment. But this is a good way to contribute to the conservation of Madagascar's biodiversity, but using sort of my skill set and being on this board for 10 years, which was the maximum that I could be on the board. In the last 4 years, I was the chair of this board. It's an endowment fund. When I left, it was at $75 million and the largest environmental fund in Africa. And it's designed to provide sustainable funding for protected areas and national parks in Madagascar. And but as you may know, we had a coup in 2009, and that sort of forced me to come out of my sort of law firm bubble. And it was the first sort of political crisis that I lived through because I was away. I was in the States during the 2 previous political problems, and that spurred me to join a civil society organization that was kind of like kind of a think tank, an opinion leader, an editorial group of lawyers who tried to intervene and to promote the rule of law and democracy and elections and constitutional issues. So I did that up until the time that I was named to head an anti-corruption body here in Madagascar in February 2019, and I'm still doing that. I'm in the middle of a 3-year term, and it's not an investigative body, it's more the strategic, the policy making and setting body to fight corruption here in Madagascar. And I'm doing that at the same time as running my small law firm. And I just wanted to mention one other experience recently, which was a short, but it was a 9-month experience where I was named as a member of what they call a normalization committee by FIFA, the International Soccer Federation, and 4 of us were named to run the Madagascar Soccer Federation because of governance issues and election issues. And that was really very intense, very interesting. And it happened to be at the time that Madagascar did well in the African Cup of Nations in 2019. But it was really an extraordinary experience because it really took me out of the law firm environment and put me out there. And as you know, soccer is it's on the ground. It's decentralized, and it was a real good preparation actually for some of the anti-corruption work that I am doing now. It was kind of really reality check, and this is what reality is on the ground. So that's pretty much where I am right now, Govind.
All right, thank you very much, Sahondra, and especially appreciate you providing voice to a part of the world that we don't hear about enough, particularly in the United States. Thanks again. We will now move north from Madagascar to Paris, France, where I'm delighted that Mira Kamdar, Read 1980, has been able to join us. Some of you may remember Mira as our 2019 Read commencement speaker. Mira, I believe you're now on your second night of curfew in Paris.
Yes, I am. We are now under there are certain hotspots in the country, including Paris and its surrounding region, that are under curfew as of Friday. So we have to be in by 9 p.m. and we can't go out till 6 a.m. And this is to try to slow the spread of the virus, the coronavirus. We're in the middle of a big second wave across Europe, but also here in France. But before I go into that, thank you, Govind, and thank you, the Read alumni. And I'm delighted to be able to participate in this. And thanks for all the alumni who are attending. It's nice that we can connect across 17 different countries. That's our time zones. That's amazing. I live in Paris. I'm a writer. I write on whatever I really feel like writing on. My recent work has appeared in the New York Review of Books, The Atlantic. I've had a couple of very recent pieces in The Atlantic. I was a member of the editorial board for the New York Times for almost 5 years, beginning when they acquired or put their name on, they had already acquired it, but put their name on the International Herald Tribune, a newspaper that many alumni, at least of a certain age, will remember as really the international paper Americans went to for news for many years. And so they wanted to have an international person to write on things from outside the US perspective, and came to me because I was an India expert living in Paris. Now, how did I become an India expert living in Paris? It's a completely improbable journey, my trajectory from Read to graduate to where I am today. I majored in French at Read. I live in France. That might seem logical, but there were many twists and turns in my path here. When I left Read, I was directed to graduate school, as many Readies are. As I recall, I don't know if it's still the case, there's an extremely high proportion of Read graduates who go on to get a PhD as compared to other schools. So that's what I did. But then when I got a tenure track job teaching at Louisiana State University, I thought, wow, what if I get tenure and I have to spend the rest of my life in Louisiana? I don't know if I can do that. So I took a leave of absence and threw everything in my Subaru station wagon and drove to New York City. And I ended up working in cross-border, in public affairs and communications on cross-border mergers and acquisitions, something completely unrelated to my training, but there was a firm that was interested in hiring me. I got bored with that. And then I moved to the World Policy Institute, which was a very prominent think tank for several decades. It is now defunct, but for several decades, it had just been acquired by the New School in New York, and they were looking for people to get involved. And I hooked up with that through the business world that I was briefly in, and started writing op-eds on things. And I really wrote my way to having credibility as an India expert, in which I had no formal training at all, to the point where I've now published 4 books on India and have participated in all kinds of international fora on India. And I don't think any of that would have been possible without the education that I received at Read. And as I said in my remarks during the commencement address last year, it's not so much, I think, the subject matter you major in at Read, although obviously learning French helped me to now live in France as a kind of a personal choice, a wonderful personal choice. But it's how you learn to think critically, to bring disparate threads of information together, to see things in a way that maybe haven't been seen before, to express that cogently in writing. And these are life skills that you can translate into all kinds of different disciplines. And so now here I am, kind of having come full circle, living in France as a writer and writing more and more about France. And in fact, my next book is about the metropolis of Grand Paris, which is a whole thing that's happening here. So I don't think any of that incredibly improbable life trajectory would have been possible without the education that I received at Reed. It really, it forged my mind in a sense. It formed my mind and made it a mind that was capable of changing and transforming with different circumstances. And I think that's a really valuable skill in the kind of very uncertain world we now live in.
Thank you so much, Mira, and we'll come back to many of these themes in a moment. Now, as we move from Paris and cross the English Channel, we overfly my current location, which is Cambridge, UK. I also spend half the year in the US, where I'll be returning a few days before November the 3rd for obvious reasons. Let me briefly say that as a Reedie from the class of 1983, I'm honored to be your moderator after having worked and traveled the world as an international economist, educator, and public speaker for nearly 3 decades. I cannot draw a straight line between my experience at Reed and my various global experiences, but I know, for example, that when I was working in various parts of Africa, bringing in mobile communications in the 1990s, there were very strong echoes of my philosophy of science class, for example, when I was talking about evidence-based policy to the counterparts I was working with in places like Mauritania, Mali, and elsewhere. And there have been many strong echoes which have come back to me in so many different ways that I know that intellectually and I will say in some sense, even in terms almost spiritually, because I'm a global ethical humanist, and I also talk about this subject a lot around the world now. The Reed education has been very, very formative. Okay, I will leave it at that, and I hope we all get time to talk about such connections. But now I'd like to move from Europe, from the UK, across the Atlantic, but down to the Southern Hemisphere to Brazil, where we have Angelina Clarke from Reed class of 2004, who has been working and living in Brazil for over 10 years. Angelina, over to you.
Great. Thank you all for being here for this event. I feel, as I joked with Chris Moses over the weekend, highly unqualified and to be on the panel, but I guess I give myself a couple more decades. I hope to represent well. My name is Angelina Clarke. I'm living and working principally in technology startups in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. As Govind said, I'm a 2004 graduate in international and comparative policy studies. That was basically economics and political science under the wing of the incredible Kim Clausing. Basically, I wanted to write my senior thesis on drug trafficking and money laundering, but the economics department basically nixed that idea pretty forcefully. So I ended up writing my senior thesis on corruption. So I suppose it's kind of inevitable that I would end up in Brazil. I've celebrated 10 years of living in Brazil this January, actually. Basically, I had literally dozens of jobs before and during Reed, but my first job after Reed was at Harvard, which, despite all of my international moves around the world, was the biggest cultural shock I think I experienced in my life, going from Reed to Harvard. Anyone who's from the East Coast probably senses that experience. And after 3 years of researching terrorism there, which is also at the intersection of power, money, and international things, where I'm always kind of finding myself, I decided to get an MBA at MIT, which felt a lot more like home, given that MIT is very involved in the intellectual curiosity that I think also drives Reed so forcefully. I graduated in 2009 and decided to switch professions, country, and language, and came down to Brazil to help large organizations with their strategy as a management consultant at McKinsey, which is a management consulting firm, and basically continuing a trend of taking jobs that my parents neither understand nor can explain to their friends. And basically the rest of my career has been, to date, has been designing and implementing strategy, particularly now for technology startups, where I've mostly been either a founder or an executive. I look for opportunities basically at the intersection of difficult problems and technology change. I have looked at what might mobile technology do to transform hiring, particularly among low-income people in Brazil. What happens to education when the best teachers can give classes at scale online to the entire country. And right now, today, actually, I'm in that delicious but thorny moment, which comes from deciding the next move in my career. And so choosing my next bet for either founding a new technology company in the female longevity and wellness space, or I'm also looking at some initiatives in mathematics education, which is a personal passion of mine, particularly for girls. So I'm on sabbatical. It was a bit of a COVID sabbatical. I have a 4-year-old, and now I am preparing to launch another adventure. Read, I think, when I think back over my career so far, I think Read was decent training, both for strategy and for entrepreneurship, because I think it combines what you need, which is to be intellectually curious and courageous, super data driven, which is very important, and also a little mad, which I think are all traits that Read both encourages and cultivates in young people and can take forward for the rest of their careers.
Thank you, Angelina, and thank you to the panel for introducing themselves. You see, we have 5 panelists, very different experiences. No 2 readies are alike, and yet I'm so struck already listening to them at there's a common denominator, and I'm sure many of you can see that. We'll come back to that in a moment in terms of what the Read education, if I can call it that, means to all of us. But I would now like to move to our first of 2 substantive thematic questions. This first question concerns taking the spirit of Read to the job of educating, writing, and research around the world. I myself remember being struck several times when I found myself adopting my internalized experience of Read style of liberal arts education to my own teaching as visiting faculty at universities in Australia and Malaysia. And I would like to understand from our panelists, how has their Read experience informed their approach to different aspects of education and or research around the world, whether in administering, advising, or analyzing secondary, university, and adult education and training, and also how they view their experience in teaching, publishing, and doing research in international settings. So please feel free to speak to whichever aspects of this broad question and sets of issues is relevant to your experience. I would like to start once again with you, Anne, in Papua New Guinea. Do we still have Anne?
We go. I think I unmuted a couple of times there. Look, thank you, Govind. Look, it's a tough question, and I think from where I'm at right now, I'm a little bit more pessimistic than optimistic in the higher education, teaching, research environment as it is right now. But I should start with how I did things. I've had a remarkable opportunity to, in a sense, recreate to the best of my ability those characteristics that I treasured in Read, about that carefully, deliberatively structured experience of excellent teaching and of maintaining a supportive culture of hard work, of dialogue, of diversity. and of common purpose for excellence, among other things. And I think I've tried to do it. I had a good fortune, like Angelina mentions, being at home at MIT. I was at home, not at Georgetown University, but at Australian National University, where my little group of PhD students kind of recreated that experience. And since then, I've worked for in different levels of responsibility, 3 different small centers where we had opportunities to teach people with extraordinary promise and extraordinary capabilities who had been left out for some reason. And in all those cases, all of them relating to some aspect of public health, we were really able to create leaders by creating a safe space for people to blossom intellectually, professionally. All of them in healthcare or public health type of issues. What makes me pessimistic is every single one of those, plus the PhD program at ANU, no longer exist in the way that it was. Forces that are common through higher education right now, at least in Australia, have forced away, really made these kinds of opportunities, things that spark, flare up and then just disappear. Higher education is supposed to be at a state of disruption. I appreciate that technology has a great deal to offer, but there's so many other issues around, at least in Australia, proliferation of universities, leading to very narrow undergraduate and postgraduate courses. We have degrees that are essentially for sale. We have frazzled lecturers who are not able to devote, and don't even think of, to be honest, devoting the time, the enormous amount of effort that's required to teach very, very well. So it's really quite depressing, which brings me to Reed to look at how is it managed, that permanence for, what is it, over 100 years? I'm not quite sure what the founding was. A remarkable thing, and how do I do it? So right now, I'm in a 50-year-old organization that probably will be around for another 50 years. And I'm very excited to work with something that is grounded in legislation and grounded in the need of what a young country needs. So maybe 5 times lucky, I'll be working with something that will last. There you go.
Okay, thank you very much, Anne, for that set of comparative perspectives across different educational traditions. And we're going to come back to this. I would like now to hear from Chris Moses, based on your experiences, including your nearly 1 decade in China.
Great. Thank you, Anne. I share certain aspects of your pessimism, at least regards higher education in the Anglophone world. But perhaps just to provide a little bit of context for why it is I'm able to do what I do here in China. The demand for primary, but also especially secondary education really comes from 3 overlapping forces. The first has to do with what's called hukou, or a household registration system that still exists in China. People are free to move and to work and to live, to own property wherever they like throughout the entire country. But certain rights and privileges are linked to a place of official residence. And one of those is secondary school education, which means that there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of families who have moved to large metropolitan areas and pursued lives here, who need to make a choice about where their children will attend high school. And so many of them do opt into an international model. That overlaps with a sense and interest in students studying abroad, particularly for university, with an idea that the range and quality of experiences they might be able to receive would be, or is perceived as being, better than what would be here in the mainland, or at least with greater diversity, and similarly could provide a competitive advantage when they return back to China. And I'd say the third, and again, overlapping force, are for students who do not thrive in the typical Chinese educational system, which is fairly rigid and in a sense, pretty Darwinian. It's ultimately driven by a series of sequential exams, which on the one hand is quite equitable and allows talented students to advance, but doesn't perhaps recognize the breadth of abilities and the sorts of risk-taking curiosity which also contribute importantly to societies, economies, and so forth. So that's the sort of niche in which we operate. I think you know, how I see myself there is one, bringing a bit of the Reed element, a sort of question-driven, inquiry-driven spirit to high schools and to the cultures that are created, whether directly through my leadership or through sort of consulting and other work with different institutions. Because I am mindful of the fact that while we are a privileged few who had the experience of attending Reed, that 99.999 some percentage of young people will not. Yet I think that they could still carry forth to whatever institution they attend with that same spirit. And China, in a way, is you know, an ancient civilization. Obviously, you know, people speak of its Confucian characteristics. Although, you know, the joking counterpoint would be to characterize Western education as Aristotelian. You know, it's somehow this unchanging thing. It's a bit more complex than that, but it's a profoundly different place. You know, in every couple of years when I start to think that I've begun to figure something out, I realize just again how ignorant I actually am. And I think that continued self-scrutiny and self-awareness is certainly something that I've brought with me from Reed. In that sense, hoping that in this newer environment, I can contribute to institutions with longevity. Institutions have played an enormous role in supporting me and in providing for me in my own life. And I would just be quite grateful if I could help see things that have staying power. So. Hopefully a bit of a balance there, Anne, with some of your reflections, but you know, this might lead to some of these larger global questions of you know, whether or not the orientation is shifting from west to east, or what that might even mean. So I will wrap up with that and thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris, for providing that frame of reference. So let's move from this Asia Pacific region and let's get a perspective from Europe, if I can put it that way. And over to you, Mira, in Paris.
Thank you, Govind. I just want to say it's so wonderful to listen to the other panelists present their experiences and articulate how the Reed education has you know, kind of shaped their approach to very disparate kinds of work. It's really fun for me to be in this, participating in this right now. In terms of the focus is supposed to really be on teaching and research. I have done some teaching. I did initially do teaching after I got my PhD. I most recently taught as a member of the faculty of the International Journalism program at Sciences Po here in Paris, which is done with Columbia University School of Journalism. So it's a very high level journalism school. And I suppose what I tried to bring to that, and perhaps what I had to bring to that was, I hope, special to my students, was to kind of really listen to them. I remember at Reed, and when I think back, you know, I was 17 years old when I got there. What did I know? But I remember my professors listening to me and then, you know, interacting with me, speaking back, and also really helping me to learn how to articulate what I wanted to express, which is what I've tried to do with my students and I tried to do at the journalism school. I remember the first teacher-student conference I had at Reed, which is of course at the heart of the Reed education, where it was a Hume 110, and I had written my first paper ever at Reed. And I went to a high school in a middle-class neighborhood in Eugene, Oregon, where I had taken AP courses and done very well and got into Reed, but I really did not have the caliber of education of some of my classmates who'd gone to boarding schools on the East Coast, for example. And my professor said, okay, this is okay, but can you think of how to change this essay into a paper? And I didn't understand what she meant. And of course, what she meant was I needed an argument. I needed to be making an argument. And they taught me how to write. And so I have tried, and as a writer, to help my students who come in at very different levels to find out what they're trying to express and to help them express that and to help them find their argument and to help them push their argument also further. And all of that I definitely got from my Reed education. In terms of the other kind of writing and research that I do, I'm a public intellectual. I don't work in a university setting now. Certainly when I was a member of the editorial board at the New York Times, the pressure was excruciating. If I were on the board right now, I would have already written an editorial on the horrific beheading some of you guys might have heard about that happened here in Paris. New York would have been right on me. When can we have it? And you have to get it just right. And tens of millions of people will read it. And people, if there's an error, a reader will comment immediately, and it's the reputation of the paper at stake because the editorials aren't signed. It's the New York Times speaking. So that the kind of really concentrating very hard and being sure of facts, making sure the sources of those facts were credible sources, and putting together an argument, saying something very strong in 400 words, and often having to write that in a few hours, is something that I received a very good graduate education, I have to say, as well. But I really think that those skills that I had to draw upon to do that work came from what I learned at Reed, starting in that first Hume 110 conference.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mira. I'm going to close the discussion on this first substantive question with my own personal observation when I taught an undergraduate class for the first time at the University of Western Australia about almost 15 years ago when I took a leave of absence from the World Bank. And I approached teaching that class from really the undergraduate experience I knew, which was Reed, which is quite a different way of teaching than what my students in Australia were used to. And these were among the best students in Australia. But they were very engaged by this approach of trying to frame questions which did not necessarily have a definitive answer or which could be answered in different ways. I was very surprised. It was a very interesting, this is what I was used to. And I have to echo what Angelina has said, what Chris has said, the culture shock of going from Reed, for example, to Princeton, where I did my graduate work, which gave me the best, I think, training I could have had in economics and public policy. But Reed gave me the way to think about so many different issues, which I took on to my career as an international economist in ways I could not have otherwise foreseen. Okay, we will come back to these issues. I would like to move to a second substantive theme, which is that of international business. And on this issue, I am going to turn to Angelina in Rio and then Sahondra in Madagascar. And once we're done, we will have each of our 5 panelists react to anything they've heard from their fellow panelists. So I want to frame my question to Anne and Sahondra broadly and ask them to respond to whatever aspect is relevant to their experience. So from the vantage point of your current and or previous locations, What are your observations on any or all of the issues of new business development, cross-border investment, policy and governance frameworks around investment, and entrepreneurial skills for succeeding in the global economy? Angelina, can I start with you first?
Sure, Govind. And I have to always frame this a little bit because I am a strategist. So I always go from the big picture down to the more micro. So that's how I'm going to frame my remarks. While still at Reed, I decided that the most interesting dynamics of this next era were going to be the dynamics of global systems, basically looking at the intersection of large emerging economies and transnational business. So that kind of dynamic of interesting, dynamic countries and transnational business, which doesn't respect borders, it was going to be where I thought the action was going to be. And for our generation, I think today it means information technology. No? And so I like to always say that we should all be political scientists and technologists today, because I think those dynamics are some of the most interesting and compelling aspects of international business today. I think we recognize that we're kind of coming to the end of an era. Since the end of the Cold War, I think everyone has more or less been playing under the same explicit rules that have generally benefited most countries. If you look at the actual data on how eradication of poverty and general well-being globally, we have been in a time of success, let's say, as a global community. Now, the US and Europe are growing kind of uncomfortable with how the game is being played and is playing out. And I would say to Chris that I think China is actually getting better at it than we are. And so I think that the intrinsic and explicit rules by which we've been playing international business are going to be rewritten. I think everyone is going to have to do a strategy reset in the next decade at the latest. And if I had to predict, I think probably by the end of the next cycle, it's going to be probably a three-poled system with the US, Europe, and Asia kind of all creating different systems of governance of international business and specifically of technology. We can hope that these systems are going to be peaceful and inclusive and extremely technological, but I would say that it's not a given. So that's kind of how I look at the global macroeconomic configuration as we look forward in this post-COVID, post-rise of China era, and post-Trump, hopefully also. I think it's probably useful. I don't know if everyone, I never take it as a given that people know very much about Brazil. I always like to use the example of Indonesia, which actually has a larger economy than Brazil, and assume that people know basically more or less as much about Brazil as they do about Indonesia. So I'm going to give for here just a really quick briefer on Brazil, which I think will help contextualize some of my comments. Today, Brazil is basically a continent-sized, middle-income, urbanized country with highly technological consumers. So 210 million people versus 327 in the US, 1.4 in China and India. So a large country, but certainly not the largest. It's the 9th largest economy, just behind Indonesia, actually, and actually ahead of the UK and France. So the economy is larger than France's economy, for example, with a GDP per capita of about 9,000 US dollars in purchasing power parity, which if you look at 63 in the US, 10 in China, 2 in India, you're looking at really kind of solidly middle income country. Actually, not to exclude anyone, 2.7 in Papua New Guinea and 528 GDP per capita and purchasing power parity in Madagascar. But there are huge regional differences in Brazil. So there are huge regional differences in terms of income. There are huge regional differences in terms of development. And then if you think about Brazil, also the Gini index, which is a measure of inequality, is 54 points, down from 63. So basically at the peak of inequality in Brazil, it was basically as unequal as South Africa. And now it's kind of moderately less unequal than, for instance, the rest of Latin America. So Brazil is super unequal, but it's way less unequal than it used to be. And Brazil basically has had a real average economic growth rate of 2% since 1988. So be perfectly frank, Brazil is barely growing. So it's a big, populous, continent-sized country that is sitting at this moment when it's neither a leader globally nor a particularly small or unimportant economy. And so I think when I think about all these dynamics, and when I think about international business, and I think about a liberal arts education and how you can combine the two, I think the value of a Reed education has basically been looking at the structured analysis of systems. So what is happening, trying to take a sober-eyed view to what is really unfolding in the international and business context, and really trying to put your finger on what matters, right? That I think is really important. The second element of a Reed education that I use every day are the concepts and the language to make the solutions that you can come up with, or the steps you need to take given the reality on the ground, make them relevant to people. And I think that's something where Reed really differentiates itself. I think I look at the other panelists. I think Anne is an excellent example of this. She focuses on access and communication in health delivery, structured, rigorous research, but then it informs strategy and focus on communication to end users. Chris works at the intersection of two powerful systems, as he mentioned, the ascension of China and the uniquely transformative nature of education. But all of this is only super powerful if you're able to communicate it in a way that moves people to change. So in my last startup, for example, I use the concept of attacking Carthage to force Hannibal's recall from Hume 101 to explain an option to our investors. But I obviously couldn't use that language when we invite rap and country music stars to record videos about algebra concepts and atmospheric science to high school students via the internet. And so I think Reed specifically gives you the intellectual courage to see and name the elements of what you see going on in the world and what the necessary solutions might be, way beyond the popular or convenient answer that the world so often hands to us.
Angelina, thank you for a fascinating set of remarks. Now let us go to Sahondra in Madagascar.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to start by saying that I'm actually a dual national of Madagascar and the US. So I have two nationalities like you, Govind, and my mother is the American one. My father is Malagasy. And for a long time, growing up, going between these two countries, it's like the two extremes, the US and a very poor Madagascar. I always wanted to try to find a way to be kind of a bridge between the two, and that's, I suppose, why I ended up being a lawyer, as someone who could speak both languages and navigate in both worlds, but bring to Madagascar the investment, to bring the financing for some of these projects, and to be that kind of bridge. But to pick up on something that Angelina said, I also do feel perhaps that that we are at the end of an era, and I'm not exactly sure that I would be able to navigate tomorrow's world, when we turn more to the east. And on top of that, we do have, Madagascar is clearly, it's one of the 5 poorest countries in the world, without being a country that has civil war, that has, we have all possible resources here, and there's really no reason that we should be this poor if it isn't just because of governance issues and issues now, I think, of big problems of capacity. And this question of education is huge here, and is a big barrier to progress and development. So when I look back at Reed, I think what I did bring back was what others have mentioned, rigorous inquiry, not being satisfied with halfway, almost looking for perfectionism. I heard someone say excellence, and yet this is, and I hate to generalize, but this is a country where you kind of just accept the things the way they are without asking why they are that way. And it was probably helpful for me to have gone to the States rather than France. We were a former French colony. And so that maybe pushed me to ask more often, well, why is it this way? Why is the Constitution written this way? Why do we accept this? And this is something that I find is lacking, and it goes all the way to the education system, the way young people are brought up. And the other thing I think that I brought back from Reed was a certain kind of, I don't know, it's militancy, I guess is how I would say. I think I remember when I was there, we were already on, it was environmental issues, it was at the time of all the old growth logging and so on. And it was also at the time of divesting out of South Africa, fighting apartheid and so on. And that's a lot of that stuck. And even though I am a corporate lawyer, I'm doing all these other things on the side because I'm looking I'm hoping to at least contribute to trying to change things. But all of this taken together in a very poor country, we have now our own brand of populism. We have leaders who really have no real vision. And I don't know where they're taking, we're only 25 million people, but here it isn't poverty, it's misery. And I'm very concerned about where we're going and what would the role of international business be and all of that. Well, it's shying away from places like Madagascar. It's not where people are going to put their investments because most of it will be siphoned off by corruption or other issues. And we have, yes, the dynamics of having the Chinese here, the Turks, the Russians, and so on, trying to get a hold of our natural resources. So when you say, Govind, that Reed is changing, I also wonder if it's beginning to also look more to the East, into better understanding other cultures and other approaches to business and a change now and perhaps in international norms and ways of doing things, and so that the future generation of Reedies can better answer these questions than I can.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Sahondra. Was that your last comment?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Angela. Thank you, Sahondra. Thank you, Angelina. I just wish I could round up all our panelists and take them to the Reed coffee shop right now and spend another 3-4 hours going through many of these questions because they resonate so much with me. I just want to make one observation before closing this question on international business. I spent a lot of my career working with governments on enabling environments for private investment. And although I used a lot of my economics education and my graduate school education at Princeton, in a fundamental sense, what really drove a lot of my dialogue was my philosophy of science class at Reed, because I was talking a lot about evidence-based policy. And Angelina, you were talking about how to communicate ideas, the communication about ideas of how to change from a state of A to a state of B, C, and D, and why one should do this, and what kinds of information and data one should use. This came through thinking about, what our modern tradition of thinking, and in particular using science and reasoning, has brought us. And I wouldn't have been able to engage in these kinds of conversations had I not intentionally gone through that experience in classrooms at Reed and well beyond Reed with other Reeds. Okay, I would like to now give each of our panelists the chance to add or otherwise comment on what they've heard. on either or both set of questions we have raised. So let me start again with Anne in Papua New Guinea.
Oh dear, I'm not very prepared for this conference, am I?
No, anything, Anne, just
Look,
anything
yeah, exactly. There's so many common threads to it. I think I think it maybe be worthwhile saying, you know, how has the read experience enable us to confront profound differences? A comment that Chris Moses mentioned, that we come with structure, and we come with the ability to make to do the hard evidence, to be the data-driven people, and to lead to challenge stereotypes. And I think that might be useful when we are in cross-cultural settings. That's partly because the advantage of the outsider, but quite often the outsider just parrots other outside views. So I'm interested in all of the, I suppose, deep connections, probably less for me than anybody else, with the countries in which they are working now, and that combined with a kind of scholarly approach to analyzing what one encounters. That's a comment. I'm not sure where you want to take this, Govind.
No, that's fine. We're going to come back to this, and so that's thank you for that input. Chris, any additional observations?
Sure, Govind. One of the things that struck me in Mira's remarks was about listening, and that's something that I often try to stress with teachers, with government officials in charge of education policy, is that you know, for most of the world, teaching is talking, and that the act of listening, it can be quite transformative, not only for students but for the entire endeavor. One thing when I think back about Reed, you know, talking of culture shock, which is another theme that has come up. You know, I was a very naive, very young kid from New England, and I showed up at Reed in my khaki shorts and navy blue polo shirt, and to say that I didn't exactly fit in is an understatement. And you know, one of the things that I appreciated was, you know, certainly there are underlying questions of structure and identity and you know, exclusionary practices we can't see, but in some at least aspirational way, Reed wanted to value you for your ideas, for your thoughts, and for what you were able to do, mostly intellectually, but I think also socially and creatively. And it didn't matter what color your hair was, or what your fashion choices entailed, or your sexual identity. And that was amazing. It took some time to get used to. I mean, you know, the questioning of biases and prejudices and preconceived notions about how people are or ought to be. You know, I think that's probably the biggest thing that's helped me navigate foreign cultures, is that rather than having some knee-jerk reaction that the strange or unfamiliar or jarring is somehow bad or unacceptable, but in fact is actually more of an invitation to listen. And so that's something that I hear from all of our panelists, and I do think does get to the heart of what I think makes Reed the place it is.
All right, thank you so much, Chris. Mira, would you like to add or comment further?
I think you're muted, Mira.
How's that?
Okay, very good.
Okay, so I'll just, many things have struck me, Govind. Two things that come to mind immediately, though, are several people mentioning a kind of being mad or militancy, or this kind of desire to be engaged and to, protest injustice or to make a place better, or why does it have to be with this? Can't it be some other way? I think that's, I don't know. I'm just here in this panel thinking that maybe that my own sense of that, which has driven my work my entire adult life, and especially, when I write on things that are happening in the world and say what's wrong and what should be done. I'm now wondering how much of that really came from Reed, and that critical inquiry and intellectual pursuit for its own sake and not really ever being satisfied. So that's one reaction connecting to that. And the other thing is, several of you have commented on this being feeling like a tipping point in the world, feeling like we're moving into another age, another zone. And I think that's evident in so many ways, from what's happening in climate change to the rise of populist authoritarian leaders to just all kinds of this pandemic, which has devastated economies around the world, including here in France. And none of us really knows what is going to come out of all of this. I think what's clear is we're not going to go to the status quo ante. The world that will emerge from this moment is not going to be like the world even, a year ago. I mean, my son lives in New York, I can't even see him. I am an international person who's used to taking an airplane from Paris to JFK like you take the bus. I can't do that. I can't see my family in India. And I think this is really life-changing in an international context, and we hope there'll be a vaccine and some of that will return. But there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think the Reed education is very helpful that way, if anything can be, because I feel my education grounded me in a kind of inheritance of human endeavor and expression from the past, and helps me to make those kinds of connections in that very kind of sincere, not just intellectual way, but really, I talked about listening, and thank you, Chris, for bringing that up. That is really, I think, part of a critical skill set that will help us navigate and also help us find solutions and creative solutions that are more needed now than ever going forward.
Okay, thank you, Mira. And Sahondra, would you like to react to anything else that has been said?
Yes, a lot has been said. It's hard to add to that, but I just wanted to say, in terms of the culture shock when you first arrive at Reed, well, how it was really extreme for me. And yet, at the same time, I come away from this panel. We were all there. It was not always easy. It was, I found at times, intellectually and all that, it was pretty tough, and felt like a real pressure cooker, and at least we came away from that learning how to multitask and do a lot in incredible amounts of time. But look where we have all gone, all the different roads taken, and where that skill set, it's just kind of incredible, all the different things that you can do with what you picked up at Reed, and how it did mold you. And even though you came with a certain point of view and contributed to that and came away with a different point of view, and I think it's just wonderful. So thanks again for having me on this panel, Govind.
Okay, thank you, Sahondra. Angelina, over to you for comments on this round, and we're going to come back to the questions of Reed in our final round.
Great. So I think everyone had incredible comments. I'd love to really spend 3 hours in a coffee shop chatting about them. But I think for me, Sahondra, I think for me, perhaps we can sympathize. I think corruption is the great challenge for emerging markets today, and for many developing countries. I think that's incredible work that you're doing. And I just bow down and respect so much that contribution. In terms of the subject of communication, I think it's really interesting. Now, Govind, you also said that you think the ability to communicate on a policy change level has been so important in your career. And I think that is where, perhaps for me, there's the biggest differentiation between what a non-liberal arts education and liberal arts education makes you capable of doing, because I find the data analytics and the careful analysis of problems is very important. But when it really comes to communicating, you really need to go back to listening to people, go back to the history and philosophy that guide people's lives. Because I feel like if you don't interweave those things into the solution you're presenting, whether it's a technology solution or a policy solution, people will at the end of the day just ignore it because they will not feel heard. They will not feel like it's really an adaptive solution to their current situation. We've had that experience a lot when trying to build something in technology, functionality perhaps that works in the States, or other things into a product. When people don't use it, don't understand why it would work for them, you have to go into people's homes, you have to interact with them where they are, and then try to weave whatever you're trying to do back into their own stories, back into their own experience, which can be very different from ours in the States, for sure, when you're dealing with people internationally.
Okay, I think we've actually transitioned over to the next set of issues, which I wanted to raise, which has to do with not just the READ campus, but what the READ experience beyond our time in campus, on campus means, and whether it's still relevant to today's global environment. So I want to be a bit of a sober skeptic when we talk about this, and I want to explicitly recognize three things before I turn it over to the panelists. First, to recognize that READ has been changing and will continue to change. We have at least 4 decades of different class years on our panel, and therefore different experiences of READ. And when I think of my time at READ in the 1980s, READ was a much less diverse place then than it is today. And yet, even in the early 1980s, I found at READ a space where issues like somebody had mentioned gender identity, sexual identity. There were so many issues where READ at that time, for me at least, was a fairly unique place for exploring, talking about these issues and thinking about it. Now that has of course changed, and we'd like to, I'd like to recognize that READ is changing. Second, it's also a truism to say that the world is changing and will continue to. We are in a very different international environment and global context today than in the days before the fall of the Berlin Wall, before the internet, before the World Wide Web, and before what many of us can see as recently growing threats, which I think we can say undermine the notion of liberal democracy, and even the notion of critical inquiry and evidence-based policy. And finally, another truism, and this just speaking as someone who has graduated from READ over three decades ago, I know I have changed in many respects, and I suspect most or all of you would say the same, however you situate yourself chronologically with respect to your time at READ. So we may answer these questions differently today than we did 10, 20, or 30 years ago. So I have 2 broad questions that I want to throw out to our panelists, and we've already started talking about this, but I want to pull back, reframe it, because these are important issues for all of us as READies. And in order to squeeze the most time for my extraordinary, most we can for my extraordinary panel in the limited time we have, I have asked them before this event to reflect on these questions, and I'm very eager to hear what they have to say. So the first question has to do with things we've been talking about in terms of bringing an approach of critical inquiry into cultural adaptation and related skills. How does each panelist see the issue of cultural adaptation from the vantage point of their current main geographic setting? And you may have answered this partially. You may want to add more. How does critical inquiry, and specifically as READ tries to foster it, play into the listening, interpretation, and other skills which make for successful communication and collaboration across cultures? So that's the first big set of issues. The second big set of questions concerns whether the READ education is even relevant in today's world? And I want to put it out very starkly. How do you situate your read education relative to other experiences you've observed, either you've had or you've observed? And can this read liberal arts education remain relevant as globalization faces new economic and geopolitical challenges? How do you see the value in today's world which a read education can bring? And when we think about thinking globally and acting locally, we're talking about inherently global issues such as climate change and sustainability, public health, governance, and diplomacy. Is the read education still relevant to all of that? Perhaps more relevant, perhaps less? Each of these questions deserves at least an hour, but I will generously give each of our panelists up to 5 minutes of their time to give their perspective. So Mira in Paris, can we start with you?
Okay. I'd like to answer the second question first, which is the read education still relevant? And how does it stack up versus other educational experiences? Look, I mean, the read education to me is kind of the quintessential liberal arts education. The liberal arts education is not something that's widespread around the world as an experience of higher education. The experience of higher education in most of the world is like the experience of higher education, even at its best, in a large university in the United States. You have lots of students listening to someone lecture at them, and then they're going to take an exam. And there's not that kind of one-on-one interaction with professors, small groups in discussions, freewheeling discussions, the push to think harder and look more closely and hone an argument. And just the value of critical inquiry and intellectual pursuit in and of itself as something to be valued. That it's a very precious thing. It's not widespread. It's a privilege to have the kind of education we all had at Reed. There are a few of other very good colleges, of course, liberal arts colleges, but Reed is kind of, I think, and I've met people who've been to any kind of comparable liberal arts college in the United States. It really kind of, it seems like the intense child of the liberal arts, parenting community, if I could put it that way. So it's an incredible privilege, and I think it gives you an incredible set of skills going forward. And hopefully, and as the other panelists I've been so interested to hear, have used those skills to try to bring positive change around them. And that's very gratifying, I think. So that's my answer to the second question, which I suppose also kind of answers the first question, that how do you bring critical inquiry into cultural adaptation? If you can't listen, if you can't observe, and if you can't be curious about something that's culturally different, well, then you can never adapt to that culture. So that the basic value of intellectual curiosity as a kind of foundational thing for no matter what field you're in, I think is also a foundational skill or value for adapting in an international context. Unfortunately, one of the things we also must adapt to is the fact that the vast majority of people one interacts with have not been educated that way. And so oftentimes, you need to, I go back to my listening to students and how I was listened to as a student, kind of tune in and try to find out, what are they trying to express? Where are they really coming from? And also another skill is to get them to listen to you, which has come up in different ways with different of the panelists as we've spoken. I can't think of a kind of jobs training, which is what a lot of higher education is now. It's highly skilled jobs training. I can't think of how that prepares people for a fluid, changing, uncertain environment. But the read education, basic skills, prepares you to go on and get your job skills and to be able to roll with the punches, reinvent yourself. And I mean, that's certainly been my experience, and I think it's still true. And I was very interested, and I'll end with this. My daughter went to Reed, and she graduated in 2017. So that's fairly recent, certainly a lot more recent than my 1980 graduation year. And, you know, I really got the very clear impression, even though Reed has changed a lot, as has the world, it's still Reed. She's a Reedie too, just like I am. 2017, 1980, it's all in there.
All right, and thank you for that family story too, Mira. Sahondra, any of these issues you'd like to address overall?
Yes, I think I'll start with the second question first too, on the relevance of a read education. And obviously, I really do think it's still extremely relevant. And I also, my daughter just enrolled at Reed, so clearly I steered her in the right direction there, at least where I think she could get the very best education and the kinds of skills that I think are important for the world tomorrow. Reed has changed. I wasn't able, because of the pandemic, to go to orientation with her. She had to go off on her own, but we did visit last summer, and you did get a feeling that it was different. It was a little less maybe sink or swim as it might have been in our day. But like Mira said, it did feel this somewhere, it was still Reed, and very comforting and reassuring, exciting, and she's really thriving, doing well, despite the very strange academic year it is with the pandemic. And with respect to critical inquiry and cultural adaptation, the challenge is going to be, you know, in countries like Madagascar, where we start to reject sort of what we think are Western notions of democracy or Western notions of, you know, of rule of law and things like that, and trying to say that there's cultural exceptionalism. There too, I think Reed is more relevant than ever. I think certain things are universal, and maybe we do need to adapt them and bring in different points of view and different historical context and background and so on, but that certain things like human rights and things like that are universal, and an education from Reed can help you in trying to, even though people don't have the same education that you do, it can help you in trying to persuade them and to work together collectively towards a better tomorrow, despite the challenges that maybe I'm worried about, but I still remain cautiously optimistic about the future.
All right, thank you, Sahondra. Anne, sitting in Papua New Guinea, how does the Reed education look? And from all the other experiences you've had?
Yeah, oh, so many things to respond to. I feel like there's a grab bag. I'm going to do a couple of things. So first off, the value of a Reed education. I have to say first, there is no shortage and no sign of less smart people in the world who can think critically. Yeah, Reed is not unique at producing such people, and it will continue no matter what happens to education. So in that way, we can rest assured. We've already talked about the listening skills and so forth that do adapt, help Reedies navigate the world, and I think navigate it for better. And I guess I also want to comment on that culture shock of going into Reed, the weirdness, really. It might not have been a diverse place in some respects in the late 1970s, but it was mad. and I was pretty wide-eyed and intimidated and everything else by what I saw. But I think it created for me a wide-eyed willingness to do that, and a true attraction for that moment cross-culturally when you hear something that's absolutely worldview shattering, and to take that and go, wow, what a different way of thinking about it. And I think I probably had that from the first Reed social that I went to, and have continued that magic of being someplace different. And you do have to say that it doesn't always make you popular, okay? I do try to shut up and just listen to people. I do try to encourage people who have positions of responsibility to also do that as well. That's not a popular thing to convey to others. And my tendency to not want to express an opinion right away until I've had a chance to understand something. And if I really don't understand it and can't get to the facts, to not express an opinion, has labeled me a snob in probably most cultures I've had anything to do with. So yeah, Reed education doesn't make you popular. I now want to switch to globalization and frame it in the two places that are close to my heart. My current place in Papua New Guinea, you really can't imagine a place more off the global the global structure. This is a country of 800 languages. You can't drive anywhere from the nation's capital. It's just flying. The geography is intensely isolating. It's still 90% rural and subsistence farming, which is a huge source of strength, of course. And I'm also deeply connected to my rural, remote area, 500 kilometers north of Perth in Western Australia. And that too has that sense of marginality from where the real things are happening. So the death of globalization, the shifting of power alliances, actually are bringing some opportunities for the places where I live. The chance to take advantage in a system that has led to lots of disadvantages before. And it's tried, but Zoom and COVID have changed everything. At least at my little institution, we've gone from being based in different parts of the country and needing a grant almost to have staff communicate because our phones don't work and most people aren't on internet and the whole bit, to having Zoom meetings weekly, to having our first education program last Friday. And it has transformed. It's also freed us. We're no longer dependent on our international scientific collaborators. Our labs have transformed from being a research labs to the COVID testing PCR institution, and doing everything themselves with dialogue from WHO rather than researchers. Researchers are now developing their own research work, which usually they always looked over their shoulder to see what their international collaborators wanted. So I think it's this time of tipping power can sometimes be very, very good for the places that are out of the way. And I'm so thrilled to see at least some of the beginning, and I look forward to the rest of my career where I'll probably be more active and less constrained by the need to earn money through a conventional job.
Thank you so much, Anne. Chris, how does Reed look to you as you start your Monday morning in Shanghai?
Yes. No, it's remarkable just being able to participate in this wonderful conversation is itself such a reflection of what Reed means. I guess when I think back there's an element of nostalgia, obviously, but my transition, similar to others, going from Reed to Princeton for graduate school was a shock. And I think that if there were some things I would like to combine from those two experiences, I think Reed, or at least myself at Reed, would have benefited from a bit more pragmatism. I love principle. I love the sort of imperative of debate in and of itself, but there's a place for pragmatism. And then I would also say, I don't know how this would resonate with others, but also ambition. At least I remember there was an element of Reed, and I remember reflecting on this in the day with Angelina, that somehow squirreling yourself away for a life of sort of subsistence and almost this ascetic sense of purpose. I get that, but ambition in a sense of competition can be healthy and important also. Princeton for me was maybe a bit too extreme version of that amongst the undergraduate culture. But it was a useful counterpoint. And that carries me forward to this then question of globalization. From the right to the left, we had Fukuyama telling us that history had ended, and Friedman pontificating about the flatness of the world. And somewhat remarkably, all of these clever people seem to have forgotten China. And that's a bit of a glaring oversight on the part of many intellectuals. So I think, in my actual studies at Reed, going back to early modern European history, intellectual history, things that I continued in graduate school, it's been enormously helpful to have that depth of understanding about probably perhaps more so than the people parroting it do. What does democracy mean? Where did it come from? What are our ideas of universality? What were the contours of debate and the Enlightenment that brought forth these goals? How are they entangled with capitalism and with structures of markets? How are they supported by the largest traffic in human beings that's ever existed across the Atlantic, and the billions and billions of dollars of world historical changing capital that was extracted from slave labor? These are perspectives reflecting to something I just saw pop up in the chat. Yes, they reflect an extraordinary amount of privilege. But there is an importance to locking yourself away for a little bit and in gaining that depth of understanding. That is, as much as protesting in the streets has tremendous value, as much as contributing to political activism is essential. I think that you need to have a much deeper recognition of the problems with which you're engaged, because they didn't happen overnight, and they're not going to disappear tomorrow. When I do teaching, I often am emphatic with students that we have this bizarre light switch version of history. It's almost as if someone pushed the light switch and we had a revolution, and then someone turned it off and we had a moment of darkness, and that's not really how the world works. But that messiness, to sit with it, to bring it to places. I had fascinating engagements with the China Security Regulatory Commission, which is essentially the Chinese version of the SEC up in Beijing, but having weekly sessions over the period of a year where they were fascinated to talk about Bernard Mandeville and Adam Smith, and they want to understand their place in the world with a similar perspective. And I guess sort of bringing that back to Reed, my greatest fear for the political conversation in the United States and more broadly globally, if we want to blame social media, I don't know, there are many things we could blame, is this amnesia, this sort of impulsiveness to declare and implement with so little perspective. So yes, so I think, of course, the privilege has costs being at Reed. but I think that in a broader perspective, they're essential and necessary.
All right, thank you, Chris, for those thoughtful comments. Angelina, any final thoughts? Do we have Angelina?
Yes, I do have thoughts, and perhaps here I can be slightly more controversial. It's been a point
Right.
that I've brought up with Reed, and that I continue to propose to Reed, because I think that the Reed education is priceless and very interesting, and absolutely important. But I do think it has a different effect on people based on their starting position in society and kind of where they're headed. And so back in my day, for instance, Reed did not teach you any of the tools of any trade, basically. And this was a large gap that a recent graduate had to kind of run to remedy. For me, I would say the salvation was probably the dialectic of read on and read off, which was basically, I spent summers and years off working, including internationally, and traveling. And then I'd come back and I'd think deeply about what I'd done and what I'd seen, and then kind of using the Reed education to inform that, and then vice versa. And that was super useful for me. I was very lucky, I think, in many ways. I was basically a full scholarship needs student at Reed. And I wonder sometimes whether the purely philosophical, purely liberal arts focus of Reed from my day served everyone from the same socioeconomic position as well as it did for me, because I think that's something that has to be taken into consideration when you think about graduating students that have critical thinking skills and the ability to write, but many of them kind of don't necessarily have concrete trade skills upon graduation that they can bank on. And that relates to the second question to some degree about critical inquiry and cultural adaptation and kind of how you work internationally. I think it's both, you have to recognize that you do have to have something to contribute, and you have to have a certain humility about what you do in fact have to contribute, particularly when you're leaving your home country and you're working and living somewhere else. I think to be successful internationally, you do have to have some sort of clear specialization, whether it's law or marketing or demographics or strategy, and ideally some sort of industry focus, or at least a problem that you know that you want to solve. Once you do arrive to a foreign country or internationally, then you establish yourself. A lot of the times the most interesting problems and opportunities will happen at the intersection of your fundamental personal passions and then kind of your qualifications. But I do think that Reed has over the years taken an almost blind eye to the idea of qualification. And I think sometimes that ill serves certain students. And I think in general, we are all here as excellent examples of successful case stories, but we have to be a little aware of selection bias. And sometimes we must ask ourselves if the average Reed graduate has had the opportunities that we had, if we're truly exceptional, or if everyone at the end of their life just kind of feels very well served by the education they've received. So those are my controversial comments on the subject.
Thank you. No, thank you, Angelina. Very thoughtful. Thank you. I haven't kept track of the time, and I don't know whether I can fairly hand this over to you, Olga, and expect that we will get into our Q&A. Perhaps we have a selection of a few questions we could throw out and ask our alumni, but over to you, Olga.
Sorry for the delay there. Hi, Govind. It's been a really great conversation. We're not receiving a lot of we're receiving comments, all of them very positive, filled with gratitude for this session, but not any direct questions. So if anyone does have a question, feel free to throw that in the chat. We have about 10 minutes left in the session. Or I don't know if there's any specific questions that you would like to close with, Govind?
No, I will make one or two comments, but I would invite anyone in the audience, particularly recent alumni and current students, to throw in a few questions. But as I'm speaking, I also want to make a little bit of a pitch about what we're trying to do here. Obviously, we're doing this from the Reed Career Alliance, and like everything else at Reed, we do it a little differently. This session was not organized as a workshop on how to write a CV or how to get a job in a particular industry. As you can see from the panel, what we're trying to do is engender the kind of lifelong conversations that we would like to have, to keep on thinking about our lives, thinking about our careers, because those questions and the answers we bring to them could change because the world is changing. So hopefully we've given a flavor of that in this session, and I would like to, hopefully to get feedback from the audience, from the panelists and others, so that we can take this kind of event to other issues. We do have a few plans down the road. We are planning, hopefully in the next month, to have a session on Read Entrepreneurs in the Creative Arts, people who've set up small businesses but are trying to bring their artistic skills to the market. We're hoping to fill a gap, which we've had for a while, hearing from reedy physicians, people who've gone on to medical practice, but in different ways. Hopefully we'll bring that to you during Paideia. But there's several other ideas. We talked a bit about climate change, sustainability today, but that is definitely worthy of a panel by itself. We've had some ideas about careers in government, some ideas about women in tech. So we obviously are limited by our bandwidth. This is a volunteer effort on the part of the READ Alumni Board, and also on the part of the staff resources we can draw upon from the READ Alumni Office. But within those limits, I hope we can continue the conversation. So I would ask everyone to please, if you have any ideas or ways in which you'd like to contribute to this effort, to send an email to me or to Katie in the Alumni Office, who's working with me on this issue, or Olga, and I'd like to continue with that. Now, Olga, do we have anything new in terms of Q&A?
Madeline is asking how COVID is affecting your work in international sites.
Okay. Who on the panel would like to answer that question?
Well, it's transformed everything I do. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Is this Anne?
It's transformed where I live. I've had to move away because of the risk averseness of the Australian government to the capital city. So I'm not with many of my colleagues. I'm with some of them. I can't get home to Western Australia without spending 4 weeks in hotel quarantine. But as I said, it's actually because, fortunately, for reasons that probably have to do with not much testing, but not entirely, Papua New Guinea has not had a serious outbreak. So in a sense, there's some opportunity, but it's also highlighted enormous weaknesses. But our institution actually has flourished.
Okay. Anyone else on the panel would like to provide any input to that question?
I would just say, Govind, I mean, in a sense, being in Shanghai, we were something toward the beginning of this whole pandemic. And remarkably, life here has returned to normal. And I almost struggle to explain that to friends around the world, and particularly to people in the US. There are certain background restrictions that still exist, but I go into our school and there's no distancing. People aren't wearing masks unless they have a cold. It's the same as if you had come here a year ago. And that's because of remarkable measures taken by the state. Whether or not those would have been viable elsewhere is a question for serious debate and discussion. But yeah, there's an impact. For months and months, it was impossible to get people into the country. Chinese nationals still face visa and entry restrictions to the United States. The shifts in global alignments in terms of where people will study, what partnerships are viable, how people foresee themselves connecting or not between countries. There were trends that were emerging before COVID, but it will accelerate them. And I think that whether that leads to localization, regional alliances, skepticism for certain governance regimes. There's so much to be seen. I would say we are really, in the beginning of the first stage of understanding how COVID is going to reshape some very deep structures in our professional worlds.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chris. We may have time for one more question, but is there anyone else on the panel who wants to address this question? Okay, Olga, do we have another question?
Actually, Govind, there is a question that says, what is something you want to advise current students to take advantage of before graduating?
Oh, great, I'm sure. All right, who on the panel would like to take that one?
May I?
Yes, go ahead.
I have so many pieces of advice. One would definitely be to take advantage of working with your favorite professor on some research-oriented project, if possible. There are generally funds for this. It's a great opportunity to understand if you really do like the academic life, and often get to jump on creating your own research strain and publishing. I would definitely recommend taking advantage, however possible, of real career-oriented opportunities during your summers. Try to get paid internships in the direction of where you might want to go or end up. Unpaid internships are complete jokes. They'll never really pan out into anything. And I definitely think you should reach out to any alumni who are doing things that are interesting to you to have a brief conversation. I think I probably had 20 of those conversations in the last few years of my Reed education, and got to speak with diplomats and development economists and all sorts of fascinating people, people working internationally. And I think that was absolutely pivotal to happiness and success in my post-Reed life. And also participate, create a legacy related to Ren Fair. You'll think about those activities for a long time afterwards. We created the snowball fight. I don't know if it still exists, but it was a great legacy for a couple of years.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
Could I jump in?
Yes, please.
Study abroad, or take leave Reed for a semester or a year. I know Reed now has a study abroad program, which it did not have when I arrived in 1975. So I just kind of hiked off on my own and had a life-changing a year in France, and here I am, more than 40 years later, having gone through all kinds of experiences. And I also, it enhanced when I came back to Reed, it changed my investment in my education, my own personal stake in my education from before I left. So Reed now has a study abroad program, like many other things it has now that it didn't have in the mid-70s. And so I would say, especially in the context of this panel, Reed in the World, take advantage of that study abroad program. It will not only change your life, but it will change what you can get out of your education at Reed.
Okay, thank you. Okay. We have a couple more minutes. Any final thoughts on this particular question? Okay. Olga, do you have anything to add, or can I make a final remark?
I think, Govind, it's time to make a final remark, and then I'll just wrap up with a couple of details.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Look, I've said most of what I wanted to say in terms of moving forward with this series. And sorry, I have to give that commercial because we are experimenting with this a little bit. This is only the second event in this series, which came about quite accidentally, I have to say. Last summer when I was asked to do an event when I was moving from the US to the UK, it was very hectic, but hopefully this has brought some interesting perspectives in terms of how we could shape this for the future. So that's all I have to say. I hope to hear from you. And I want to give once again a really big thank you to all our panelists. It has been incredible to bring 17 time zones into one space in a Zoom event at Reed. I wasn't sure we would be able to work this, but we always try to, raise the bar really high and try something new. And I think it's the energy, generosity, and creativeness of all our alumni which has made this possible.